Okay. Apparently that was apparently I had some issues with OBS there. I hope they have been fixed, and I hope this stream will go through smoothly now. So I will be restarting from the very beginning. Here we go. Okay, so on this stream we will be looking at the on this series that I'm starting now. We will be looking at the history of Prussia. So I want to kind of cover the history of Germany, and of course to cover that, Prussia is one of the, if not the most important countries. And there's a resource I'll be using. It's called Preußen, Aufstieg und Niedergang. It's a very comprehensive book by Christopher Clark on the history of Prussia, starting in 1600s and going all the way until 1947. I don't know if I will be doing it up until 1947, because I'm really only interested in, let's say, Prussia up until the Weimar Republic. I also think that YouTube isn't really too keen on people doing, let's say, post-Weimar Republic history. So most likely I will just be doing until the Kaiser abdicates, and then as a kind of epilogue I'll also do a bit about the Weimar Republic. And oh, come on. And okay, it seems I can't play music. I hope the it says it still has a bad connection. I hope it's not too bad. Maybe if you're listening in right now, put into chat how good or bad it is, because I really can't tell. I'm just sitting here with all my windows open. So and it's also all still very new for me. So it would be appreciated if you said, "Oh, we can hear you," or "Oh, we can't." Yeah, put it in chat. So in terms of Prussia, okay, can't just. Okay, I guess I have to deal with this. I hope everybody can hear it. I know that if you can't hear it, you can't type anything into the chat, so it might be I might just be talking to myself today. I hope that is not the case. So, in terms of Prussia, it is, of course, the country that is credited with creating Germany. I think that is a bit of a misnomer looking at Germany, how it is today, but it is still one of the, if not the most important country in the history of Germany. It's good for you? Oh, perfect. Okay, I'm so relieved. So we'll be covering Christopher Clark's book Preußen, Aufstieg und Niedergang. It's a German-only source, so I hope to everybody who is listening in, who isn't from Germany, you might be getting something out of this, because this is something only Germans use, and now you also get to partake in the fun. We'll be going through it chapter by chapter, and it will not be, let's say, a reading of the book. I'll just be kind of summarizing the main gist of every chapter, and then also be enriching it in the things where I would say, oh, this is important, this is something that should really be covered in depth, and kind of skipping over things where I say, okay, he's going into the very deep end on stuff that isn't really important to the average viewer, let's say. Okay, so we'll start in the situation in 1600. This is actually a bit before that. This is a map from 1522, but the borders are kind of still the same. All the border changes you see here will be happening afterwards, and we will cover all of them. So you here see Berlin, the capital of Brandenburg, it was called at that time. It will later become Brandenburg-Prussia, which is this part, and then later will be known as Prussia. You see the Uckermark, the Old Mark, you see Frankfurt an der Oder. This city will also be important. Nowadays, those of you who are German might know a bit about Frankfurt on the Oder. It is not the Frankfurt that maybe those of you who only know a small amount about Germany know. There's a Frankfurt down here as well, next to the Main. But that is not that Frankfurt. It is a different city that is also called Frankfurt. So Prussia at this, or Brandenburg rather, at this time is, well, more or less insignificant. It is rather large for the HRE definitely, and it is an elector. It's even called electoral mark. But it is not, let's say, a country that shines in any geopolitical sense. If there were geopolitical analysts at the time, they would most likely say, well, Brandenburg is not going to do anything in the near future. They're very insignificant. And the reason for that is that it has no real river system going through it. You might be seeing here the Elbe and the Oder, which is true, but in terms of river systems, you want two things. A, you want to control the access to the water. And you see, Brandenburg doesn't do it for either of these rivers, because otherwise somebody who's here can just say, you don't get to trade. Your ships don't get to pass into the harbor. Or at least you want to have the river system go through your country, because rivers always have this highway structure, this highway function, where they facilitate trade between your countries. So it's very hard, let's say, to trade from here to here. I hope you guys can you guys see the things I'm doing with my cursor? Otherwise, I'm just saying here to here, and you guys can see it. Maybe put it in the chat again if you can see my cursor, not because I hope you can. You can, like, trading on land is very hard, but trading down the waters, down the Elbe and down the Oder, that is something that is very easy. That is something that you can do very quickly. So you want connected river systems, and they don't really have that. Actually, the family this entire series will be about, the Hohenzollerns, try to connect Berlin to Frankfurt. They try to dig a channel through here. And that, of course, would give their country kind of a connected river system. So it's a very, very good idea. Okay, you can see the cursor, perfect. So it's a very good idea, but due to costs, they had to scrap it. Then in terms of, so when you look at geopolitics, geography, you always kind of look at the main strategic goods. So for example, like, where do you get your food, where do you get your weapons, all that kind of stuff. And well, the situation with Brandenburg at this time is they don't get anything. They have some areas of agricultural yield right here in the Uckermark and here in the Old Mark and in Prignitz. And it's not the case that they are completely worthless. So they actually are a place of immigration. So other Germans are immigrating into Brandenburg. So they are better than other people. But on the whole, like, it's looking at this massive, or for HRE standards, massive country, there isn't much going on. They do not have any kind of strategic resources. They do not have a major mining capacities. They do not have metallurgy. Metallurgy is, of course, also very important at the time. They have one source of metallurgy, but their metal is substandard and breaks during the winter, and cannot, let's say, compete with metal from the neighboring country or duchy of Saxony. So they have to heavily subsidize their own metal production, and also put import tariffs on the Saxon metal, so their own, let's say, metal capabilities aren't completely outcompeted and destroyed. They have no protective geography, so sometimes countries don't have anything, but at least they have nice mountains around them, or are just completely mountainous, like Switzerland. But Brandenburg has nothing of this. They're open on every side. All of this is like a mix of plains and forests, so nothing that's too hard to navigate. They have below average agricultural soil. And they also have a lot of sand and a lot of swamplands. Actually, pairing that with the immigration thing, some of you, especially those who are a bit more familiar with German, might know of the rat catcher of Hamelin. That's a story that I have actually talked about in one of my videos. And the interesting thing with this story is that even though it kind of has a, let's say, a figure that is very archetypal and has a moral to it, and kind of outlines the what happens when you have what even is nowadays called a red catcher, but it still doesn't really seem like a tale. It more seems like a historical account of something that really happened. And one of the things that happened in Berlin at the time, and many other cities in Germany as well, something that with which the red catchers often identified, is that Berlin and Brandenburg, they are going through the country and they are telling people to immigrate, because they say we have all this open land and you can come here, you can start your own living, you can basically be your own man. Kind of the same thing that the United States will later promise, to people. We have all this empty land and you can settle here. Brandenburg is promising to young men all around Germany. And what happens in actuality is all these young men get into Brandenburg, they get allotted some piece of swampland and they drown. So to the other Germans, it feels like there's this rat catcher who steals all the youngs, like the 16-year-olds, stuff like that, maybe the 18 to 20-year-olds, and they all come with him and then they die in his trap. It feels like they're just there to kill the children, when actually what they're trying to do is, well, again, get these people to settle in their land, to kind of increase the yield and the use of the land, and they hope that the people will get rid of the marshes and the sand. There's also no ethno-cultural union. So this is country that the mark actually gives it away. Mark is a very old word for border country. This is country that the Germans took from the Slavs. You might say this because this is of course all Slavic country. And this also used to be a Slavic country. The Germans took it away from the Slavs, and so it is a German, let's say, colonization of Slavic lands. And there's still Slavic enclaves who don't speak German all around Brandenburg. And they will kind of vanish naturally. They will be either absorbed or outcompeted, and so on and so forth. But at the let's say, starting into the 1600s, this is still not... or the 17th century, this is still not achieved. So we can't even say, oh, this is a country that has a very good, they keep together very well, they're very well organized. Many people know of Prussia, of course, as this major military power. At this time, it's militarily worthless. It doesn't really have a military. It just has a few guys and it can't produce metal. So it can't produce new weapons either. So the geopolitical situation of Brandenburg at this time is rather poor. Again, they have some upwards mobility. It's not like they're begging for food, basically, in these parts. But they are not in any ways kind of an expansive power, or something like, for example, the Netherlands or the Low Countries, which, even though they are very close to a civil war or to a war, and we will get to that also, they are still very, very rich countries, or very, very rich regions, and that kind of makes up for many of the, let's say, political shortcomings. And we will see in a bit that Brandenburg is kind of the opposite. So going over to the political situation. So what Brandenburg is operating on is very common for their times. And that is the estate system, which kind of takes over from the feudal system that dominates the medieval world. In a sense, the medieval world is often set to end because of the estate system. The first thing that I have to point out about the estate system, and this was very weird to me, kind of researching this and looking this up in English, is that this is not feudalism. When I look into the estate system in English, then a lot of sources say or talk about feudalism, but the estate system that comes about in what is called the early modern period, so kind of the 1500s to the 16 and 1700s, or the 16th to the 18th century, they are very different in various degrees. So the estates enjoy high privileges and influence, and on the right you see a common, let's say, parting of the estates into the clergy, the aristocracy, and the peasantry. Although only these two enjoy privileges and influence. They get together frequently in what might be understood as parliaments. The word for these is actually Landtage. If you're in German, then you might know that Landtage still exist. They don't really have anything to do more with these old versions of them, but that is where the name comes from. They in Brandenburg specifically, their roles kind of change depending on where they are. In Brandenburg specifically, they decide to enforce tax policy and have the right to veto. They decide and enforce tax policy and have a veto power when it comes to alliances. The estates is also, they are made up from different elements depending on the country. So for example, in Brandenburg, the estates are made up of the nobility and the clergy. And there's like some landowners and some idiosyncrasies in every estate system. But basically, these are the two main parties that make them up. Another situation that in Brandenburg is that prior promises were given by the Hohenzollern dynasty, so they inherit Brandenburg in the 1400s, and even when they inherited, it already has a starting version of an estate system. And then I think 100 years later, they give promises to the estates to consult them in every issue. And that gives the estates great influence, both, let's say, perceived as well as actualized in how the politics play out. So to kind of go a bit deeper into the estate system, because I think it's very interesting, it's very important, and it's something that isn't just part of Germany or Brandenburg at the time, but of all of Germany and most of continental Europe. Again, here you see the three main estates, and they have their they are allotted their lot, of course, by the Logos, by Jesus Christ, and each of them has a kind of command given to him by the Christ, and that is tu supplex ora, you pray fervently. I think it's humbly, you humbly pray. Then tuque labora, which is you all labor, and tu protege, which is you protect. It is also the case that it's just the clergy and the nobility doing things is also wrong. So, for example, in a land, in a duchy that holds cities, usually the mayors also, or the city is their own estate, represented by the mayors. In a normal estate system, it's the case that these groups get together, and they all get together. All the estates get together in these parliaments, you might call them, and then an issue is kind of presented. So, for example, the Lord wants to increase the taxes, and so the members of the estates then start to kind of debate amongst their group. So there's a group of the clergy, there's a group of the lords, there would be a group of the that represents a city, and then, for example, sometimes a duchy, like for example Bavaria, I think, has a merchant estate, and those also get to sit in, and they also decide amongst themselves, and whatever the majority opinion is the one they go with. So let's say 5 of the 10 bishops, or 5 of the 9 bishops there are in favor of raising taxes. Then this side of the estate, they say, okay, we are for that. And then when each of the subsections of the estates, when all of them are in favor of something, and the Lord is also, he is one in and of himself, then they say, okay, this is what we do. Another thing about the estate system is that we can see within it the shift from a politics that understands itself as divinely based to a politics that understands itself as humanly based. And the estate system is really kind of in between both. So in feudalism, which again is why I said it's not feudalism, in feudalism you have a very, very, very clear understanding of a kind of fractal system, where the king is just a vessel of God. And the king gives God good stewardship of the lands he's entrusted to, and God gives the king good graces. And then usually the bishopric is kind of the bishops and the lords. They're vessels of the king, and they give him knights and taxes and that kind of stuff. And the king offers them graces and protection. And then the lords usually have lords below them, and they might have lords below them, and they might have lords below them, and that goes all the way down to the last peasant. And the relationship is usually always that the above element gives you a certain grace, a certain direction, a certain protection, and the lower part gives you the resources you need. And so this is something, of course, I talk a lot about in the main series, where you have this kind of heaven and earth distinction, where the heaven is above and the earth is below. And the heaven kind of instructs and sets the rule, and the earth accommodates. And we have a very similar understanding of how politics works in the feudal system. There is, of course, let's say, an action. In theory, the feudal system is beautiful. It's very perfect. It also has very idiosyncrasies to it that make it very cool. So, for example, even though the lord is given a tithe, or the liege is given a tithe, and every kind of member of the chain, he is supposed to kind of give back a bit to his most or his best vassals. And that is kind of supposed to incentivize good behavior and to ensure justice. So he's kind of held to redistribute in a certain amount according to his own understanding of justice. But what this, for example, usually turns into is that just massive favoritism. So sometimes it turned out amazing, and sometimes it just was bad. But regardless of, let's say, how good or bad the feudal system is, the feudal system was also very much marked by struggles along this chain. And the estate system, in a sense, is an outcome of the feudal system. And one of the big things about the estate system, and I think it's so beautiful in this image here, is that this last element is kind of forgotten. It's not that they just do away with it during this estate period, but looking at where feudalism is and looking where the system afterwards, which is democracy, is, you can see it rather clearly. And that is, the king is not in this picture. This is not, the king is not in here. These are the lords that are under the king. Well, there is a king in here. It's the King of Kings, right? It's Jesus Christ. But not the king himself. And what happens is that the king is identified with the Christ. And so this idea kind of completes the country into one whole thing, where everything is in here. But the king and the Christ can be interchanged. And that, of course, turns into, let's say, its final form in absolutism, where the king identifies himself with the Godhead. Of course, Louis, the Sun King, right? In his very occult understanding, he is kind of the Godhead in a sense. And you can see that very clearly if you go to Versailles. If you're ever in Paris, go through Versailles and just like look at all the occult things Louis puts in there, and how he puts himself into the room of the Most High God of gods of the Romans, and the room for the space for the God-man is kind of forgotten about. And of course, what the absolutist system does, it kind of like kills all the estates. That's famously what he does. He says "L'État est moi." That means all of this is l'État, and all of this is now him. And so now we have this kind of switcheroo where it's only one man who's the entire state, and from that you get all of man being the state. So you go from the state is based upon God to the state is based upon this kind of, let's say, politics that kind of tries to appreciate God, or that is God-given. Then to the state is based upon the king, and the figure of the king might be Christ, might not be Christ. To the state is the king, to the state is a man, to the state is the people, all men in the state. And that is where we are today. So it's a it's a long con, basically. Okay. But then that is kind of the internal politics, but there's also external politics for Brandenburg. Something very important about this time, we're still in a time of kings and lords and dukes, and that is that family politics is politics, and foreign policy is run on a relational and family basis. Actually, something Clark mentions in the book that I find kind of interesting is that the Hohenzollerns understand themselves mostly as family heads in the beginning, and only later, once their country becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, they understand themselves as, well, owners of a country or heads of a country. In the beginning, things are mostly about the family, and the well-being of the country is just because they want the country to work well because they want to have the family to have a good asset. And then later, the well-being of the country is kind of their own little thing. In the beginning, it's more like it's a family that accrues wealth and assets, and they want a well-being country just for that. And the last thing that is very important about Brandenburg is that it has high privileges as an HRE elector. So even though Brandenburg has no military and has a lot of land that is more or less worthless, so the real size of Brandenburg is much smaller than it is on a map, it is still very important politically. The HRE is inwardly flexible, balanced in terms of power. So even though it has an emperor sitting at the top, it is not like the emperor can just push through things. And it is decentralized. So it isn't really a common policy. It just has like common laws in some aspects. It is kind of like a NATO or a United Nations in smaller. Where, you know, the king gets voted in by a set of important electors. And then, of course, these votes for the king usually mean concessions by the ruling family, which are almost always the Habsburgs. So if you're in an elector seat, you kind of have a pretty sweet gig rolling. And you can see that also in the things we're getting to. And all in all, we can see that if we look at this, Brandenburg is not in a very good political situation, and they're not in a very good geopolitical situation. The political situation is kind of like slightly above average. Their estate system will be a major clutch to them. There's a lot of wealth in their country, or all the wealth in their country basically that they don't get is bound up in here, and they can't get to it. The estate's kind of protected, and we will see why that is important in a bit. And then in terms of the HRE, well, yeah, they have a very nice situation as an HRE elector, but it's not really, let's say, even though it is powerful and is good and will come in handy to them, it is not a position of just making it being set up for the future, basically. Especially because they don't have a military, and we are starting times that are militarily highly divided, of course, because of the Reformation, what it brought to the Holy Roman Empire. So, and that is the first thing where the family gets in. And something we will see and we will kind of get to in this video is that the success of Brandenburg, especially at this time, is largely due to what the Hohenzollerns do. It's really a country that is kind of pulled ahead by its ruling dynasty. So in the early 1500s, the Hohenzollerns convert. They convert to Lutheranism at first. Later, they will convert to Calvinism. And it is handled very discreetly. It's actually that the wife of one of the lords converts. He doesn't want her to convert, but she does it anyway, and then she flees to Saxony. And later her son will convert, but all of it is very discreet. They adhere to Catholic customs and to Catholic liturgy. They have very small changes in this time. There's early pushes against Protestant pushes against the emperor, and they do not involve themselves in it. They maintain their loyalty to the emperor, but they can also try to see the Protestant side. And this, over time, establishes them in the sweetest situation in any political conflict, and that is the position of the mediator, where the emperor has a good view of them and the Protestants have a good view of them, and so they kind of are the perfect balancing power for a while, although that will vanish in a bit. What happens in there will be a peace signed in 1555 after long conflicts between the Protestants and the Catholics. That's the Peace of Augsburg, which kind of allows Protestants to be Protestant in a sense. And after this, in the 1570s, tension had cooled a bit. It's not like being Protestant is okay in the empire, but while some people are allowed by law because the political situation kind of had to allow it, these Protestants were backed by major political factions outside of Germany at the time, so for example France, and the emperor kind of tooth-grittingly allowed them to be Protestants and to convert their countries. And their duchies. And this led to a serious conversion in the 1570s of Brandenburg. They did two things to convert. One, something that was a very clear part of Protestantism, and that also kind of gets back a bit to the political situation here, is that this was something, let's say, that goes back to Luther, is that the head of the state is replaced. God is replaced as the head of state, and instead the king is placed in his place because of a separation of the realms, basically, where it said God rules over the extratemporal or the heavenly realm, and then man rules over the temporal realm. I think that's how it goes. And so the head of the church is the king, not just the head of state, but also the head of the church. And of course, the reason Luther does this is very easy. Luther doesn't like the Pope. So he makes it so he interprets the Bible in a way where, of course, the Pope is illegitimate and a local church has to be run by the king. And that, of course, for Brandenburg means that the local church is headed by the dukes. And this is what they do. And they also go into the university in Frankfurt, or Frankfurt Oder, which is why I said Frankfurt is important. Which is kind of their main university, and they replace all the chairs with Lutherans. And so now they have an intellectual elite. Of course, the intellectual stream is also the most flexible stream and the most prestigious stream in terms of upwards mobility at the time. And they kind of make it a Lutheran-only thing. So what Mencius Moldbach might call the cathedral is being overturned into a completely Lutheran institution in Brandenburg. And that will come to bite them in what happens next. And that is, so as I already said, politics at the time is marriage politics. And the Hohenzollerns, as you might have seen in terms of the religious wars, they are a very cautious family, but that does not mean that they're also a very ambitious family, and they're very expansive. And they build upon the one thing they have, and that is, of course, their political prestige, and they do that very well. And they marry into major dynasties. They marry into Denmark, they marry into Poland, and they also marry into Western countries. They kind of marry all around. They once marry into Pomerania, trying to get the access to the sea here, because, of course, access to the ocean is amazing in terms of trade. And what their marriage game yields them is two major areas, and that is Prussia, and the other one is Jülich-Cleves, which is actually more than this, but we'll get to why they only get this part in a second. So both of these aren't easy to come by. If you've ever played a game in the time period, for example, Europa Universalis 4 is a very, very popular game where you kind of play in this time period, and you also do these kind of things. And what happens there usually in these kind of inheritance things is you inherit, like you marry into a family, then they don't have an eligible heir, and then you inherit it. That's not really the case for these areas, and so it's not really clear, let's say, when they get them. What rather happens is they marry into families, and then they get concessions to rule over something, and then they strengthen their claims on that stuff, and then it's an entire legal procedure. Again, politics at the time is more families kind of, let's say, squabbling over what is essentially real estate. Like you can see this duchy and this duchy all as real estate. When you see these titles of people at the time, he's the Duke of Bavaria and the Count of Brussels and whatever. then what you actually see is just a listing of the real estate titles, the real estate holdings. And so it's a very long, very arduous process. You might say they get this in 1609. You might say they get this in 1618. I put the last date, 1618, to kind of show where we're going. But yeah, over time they're getting claims to Prussia, and they're strengthening them. They're developing on them. They're talking to the Polish again and again and again, kind of really working in there. And it's the same with the western part as well. They get claims over Jülich-Clev, which is a major region around here, and they press their claims against all the other claimants. It's always kind of every time somebody dies, there's like a group of people showing up who go, mine, mine, mine. But there's a problem with Jülich-Clev. And that is why we're still in major tensions. And while these guys here, the Netherlands, have split from these guys here, which is the Low Countries, which is a Catholic part of the country under Habsburg rule, and this is a Protestant part of the country that just became its own thing. They broke free, I think in the 1570s or 1580s. And of course, that means both of these are eyeing one another, and everybody knows this is going to be a war. Both sides are preparing for war. There's a lot of Protestants in the region. There's a lot of Catholics in the region. The Protestant League and the Catholic League are forming. And of course here, of course in 1609, right, the Protestant Union forms and the Catholic League forms. And the problem with that is that this part of Jülich-Clev is the exact corridor through which you would have to walk for either of these countries to invade the other. So basically all of this is kind of hard to traverse, all of this border region, but going through here and also this part, this is very easy. So whoever controls this, whichever side controls this, kind of has the upper hand on the other side. And this really is the place where the Catholic-Protestant conflict is kind of believed to play out. All of this is Catholic-Protestant kind of intermixed, and there's other theaters in here, but this is really one of the main parts, because the Dutch, this entire region is basically the richest region in Europe at the time. Okay, so what do? Well, the Protestants support their claim here and say, we will defend this. And there's also a Catholic part, I think it's Saxony, that also claims Jülich-Clev. And the funny thing with this is that, of course, the Catholic side is supported by the emperor, but the emperor is supposed to be impartial. So the emperor is not supposed to invade one of his countries, but he gives the Catholic side, which is officially under Bavarian leadership, he gives them their protection. And Brandenburg and Saxony kind of make an agreement that they will both strengthen their position in the region, and then we'll see what happens, basically. It's a very weird agreement, and nobody's happy with it. So everybody's kind of starting to move troops here. And the situation is getting heated and heated and heated. And the real problem is, of course, that Prussia is still militarily weak. They only control this part. And now is where the estates kind of get into play. So the estates are all from here. Like these parts also have estates, but they are so far removed from the sphere of influence of the lords of the Habsburg, of the Hohenzollerns, that this is basically just claimed country. In reality, this is just under let's say, occupation of local lords. And even though somebody might inherit this in the future, they don't really have it. And because they can't project power here, all their power is in here. And they don't have a military. If they had a military that kind of could step over here and that kind of could step over here, that would be a different thing. But they don't. And the thing they would need to have a military is either metallurgy, kind of the ability to produce weapons, which they don't have, or they would need money to kind of invest into something, like invest into mercenaries, invest into a military, basically, maybe just invest into bigger metal production. But because of the estate system, the lord can't easily increase his taxes. And the estates are all living in here. they have nothing to gain from territorial acquisitions. In fact, they might be weakened from territorial acquisitions because, of course, if he holds these parts, then there are 3 geographically dispersed parts in this country, all of which are just united by one lord, which he might be able to play against one another. So they really don't want to support him. And this leads to him being completely reliant on the Protestants, who are just going head to head with the Catholics, basically. And of course, this will erupt into the 30 Years' War. But a solution is given. Jülich Clev is parted into 2, and he gets these 3 parts, which are Jülich, which are. Let me check my notes. Which are Mark, Ravensburg, Ravenstein, and don't let me say the fourth one. I think Clev. Yeah, Clev. So he gets these 3, and then the Saxons get the other 3. And with this, a major crisis, which almost threatened to have Habsburgs invade his country, is dissolved. So now we're in the situation in 1618. This claim has been more or less gained from over many years from the Polish, and this claim has just been diffused in a very heated argumentation of inheritance, but this is now also theirs. And now this is basically the end of the chapter. Brandenburg is in a horrible situation. They are military still weak, no ability to kind of actualize their potential, but of course they have huge potential. The other thing that happens is they leave the Protestant Union, they convert to Calvinism, they leave the Protestant Union, and they begin to politically isolate. They're now neither part of the Catholic Union, of the Catholic Alliance or the Protestant Union, and they are now just basically still caught in between these fronts, with a country that has a massive span but also massive holes within it. And it's a beautiful starting point in a sense. It really is an opening position because, of course, what will happen in the next 100 of years and even more of Prussian foreign policy and of Prussian expansionism is that they will just try to connect these 2 parts to, in the end, kind of make this into one big country, which we will know as the late Prussia, which will unify Germany. But this is not the day for that. And what actually happens is that the lords of Prussia, after this situation kind of has finished out, he becomes a drunk, he retreats into himself, there's multiple accounts of him drunkenly lashing out at people, hitting people, that kind of stuff, and just being generally a more or less depressed waste of space because he doesn't see a future. He doesn't know what to do. He knows he has a lot of land, he wants to hold it, he wants to keep it, but he is in a very vulnerable position that doesn't seem to have any way out of it. And he then has a stroke. The stroke leaves him with a speech impediment, and once he finally and completely and consolidatedly has inherited Prussia, which is in 1618, a delegation will describe him as outwardly alive, inwardly dead. And I think that is kind of the end for this part. Again, it's like the first chapter. This is the opening situation which Brandenburg is in, and the whole but also massive potential they will have to get out of. They are still a very important elector, but they kind of played their cards against the emperor, who's now massively mad at them, and they're also not on really good terms with the Protestant Union anymore. The 30 Years' War is going to happen, and with that, I hope everybody of you had a great time, and we will see how that Prussia kind of gets these other parts and manages through the 30 Years' War in the future. Bye bye.